In the soft glow of early spring at Hillside Nature Reserve, where the Blue Ridge Mountains cradle a sanctuary of wild beauty, a moment of both hope and shock unfolds. Rescued Bobcat Maxine, once a captive in despair, now faces the miracle of motherhood. As she gives birth to her litter of 5, as the first 4 cubs arrived, healthy and strong, the 5th brought an unforeseen twist that no one could have predicted. A routine event turns extraordinary when the attending veterinarian witnesses a final birth that defies all expectations, an image so startling it leaves the entire team in stunned silence. What emerged was more than just life. It was a revelation that would forever change how they viewed the resilience of nature. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The morning mist hung low over Hillside Nature Reserve, nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in western Virginia. It was early April, and the forest was awakening from its winter slumber. Wildflowers dotted the landscape with splashes of purple, yellow, and white, while birdsong filled the air with melodious tunes. This 200-acre sanctuary had been established 15 years ago by retired biology professor Margaret Wilkins, who had dedicated her life savings to preserving a piece of wilderness for future generations. Among the many creatures that called Hillside home was Maxine, a 4-year-old female bobcat with distinctive tufted ears and striking amber eyes. Unlike most of the reserve's residents, Maxine hadn't been born wild. She had been rescued 2 years earlier from an illegal exotic pet operation in Tennessee, where she had been kept in deplorable conditions, malnourished, and terrified of humans. When authorities raided the facility, they found Maxine cowering in a rusty cage barely large enough for her to turn around. Dr. Brian Carter, the 55-year-old veterinarian who oversaw the medical care of all animals at Hillside, remembered the day Maxine arrived as if it were yesterday. Her fur had been matted and dull, her eyes vacant and fearful. It had taken months of patient rehabilitation, proper nutrition, and gentle handling before she began to regain her natural behaviors and instincts. Though she would never be released back into the wild, her fear of open spaces and lack of hunting skills made that impossible. She had gradually come to regard the reserve's spacious, naturalistic enclosure as her territory. "She's come so far," Brian often remarked to his colleague, 34-year-old wildlife specialist Ethan Nolan, a former park ranger with a rugged appearance that belied his gentle nature. Together, they had spent countless hours observing Maxine's progress, documenting her recovery, and ensuring her environment provided adequate enrichment. 6 months ago, the reserve had taken in another rescued bobcat, a young male named Ranger who had been found orphaned but healthy near a logging site in West Virginia. After a careful introduction period, Maxine and Ranger had formed a tentative bond, their initial wariness giving way to mutual grooming and shared napping spots. The staff had noticed the pair's increased affection during the winter months, but hadn't expected a pregnancy. Bobcats typically mate in February or March, with kittens arriving about 2 months later. By their calculations, if Maxine was pregnant, she shouldn't deliver until late May or early June. Yet on this misty April morning, something was clearly wrong. Ethan arrived at the reserve shortly after dawn for his usual rounds, thermos of black coffee in hand. As he approached Maxine's enclosure, he immediately noticed her unusual behavior. Instead of lounging on her favorite elevated platform or patrolling the perimeter of her territory, she was pacing restlessly in the back corner of the habitat, pawing at the soft bedding material in the den box the staff had installed months earlier. "Hey there, Max," Ethan called softly, using the nickname the staff had given her. "What's going on, girl?" Maxine ignored him, continuing her agitated pacing. Every few minutes, she would stop, crouch low to the ground, and emit a low, guttural sound. Almost a growl, but higher-pitched and more plaintive. Concerned, Ethan pulled out his phone and called Brian. "I think you'd better come in early," he said when the veterinarian answered. "Something's up with Maxine. She's showing signs of distress, and I'm wondering if she might be going into labor." "Labor?" Brian sounded surprised. "That can't be right. We estimated she wouldn't be due for at least another 6 weeks." "I know, but she's nesting, vocalization is different, and she's alternating between pacing and assuming what looks like a birthing position." There was a brief pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Brian replied. "In the meantime, alert the rest of the staff. If she is in labor, we need to be prepared, especially since it's premature." By the time Brian arrived, wearing a rumpled flannel shirt and faded jeans, his graying hair still damp from a hasty shower, Ethan had already set up a makeshift monitoring station near Maxine's enclosure. The wildlife cameras that normally recorded her activities had been repositioned to focus on the den box, and basic medical supplies were arranged on a folding table. "Any changes?" Brian asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Jessica Mills, the reserve's 29-year-old education coordinator, who had arrived shortly after Ethan's call. Her contractions seemed to be getting stronger and more frequent, Jessica replied, pushing her thick-framed glasses up her nose. "I've been timing them, about 4 minutes apart now." Brian nodded grimly. Premature labor in captive bobcats isn't uncommon, especially for first-time mothers who've experienced trauma. "Let's hope the kittens are developed enough to survive." The team watched anxiously as Maxine continued her laborious preparation, digging frantically at the bedding material, turning in circles, and occasionally emitting heart-wrenching yowls that echoed through the morning air. Though they were all experienced wildlife professionals, there was something particularly poignant about witnessing Maxine's struggle, perhaps because they knew her history, the abuse she had suffered, and the remarkable resilience she had shown in her recovery. "Should we intervene?" Jessica asked quietly, her voice tense with concern. Brian shook his head. "Not unless absolutely necessary. Wild animals, even those in captivity, generally manage birth without human assistance. Our presence might cause her more stress, which could complicate things. For now, we observe and prepare for any emergency." As the morning wore on, more staff members arrived, drawn by text messages about the unexpected development. By 10:30 a.m., a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance from the enclosure, their faces etched with concern and anticipation. At precisely 11:14 a.m., Maxine gave a final, powerful push, and the first kitten emerged, a tiny, wet bundle of dark fur, no larger than a human palm. The staff collectively held their breath as Maxine carefully cleaned the newborn, licking away the birth membrane and stimulating its breathing. After what seemed like an eternity, the kitten emitted a feeble squeak, and a ripple of relief passed through the onlookers. "Good girl, Maxine," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're doing great." Over the next hour, 3 more kittens were born, each following the same pattern. Maxine's intense labor, the emergence of a small, damp form, and her immediate, thorough cleaning. By early afternoon, 4 tiny bobcat kittens nestled against their mother's warm body, their wet fur gradually drying into the characteristic spotted pattern of their species. 4 healthy kittens, that's a good-sized litter for a bobcat, Brian observed, making notes on his tablet. She seems to be handling motherhood well, considering her background. But Maxine wasn't finished. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, her restlessness returned, and it became clear that another kitten was on the way. This labor seemed different, though, more prolonged and difficult. Maxine panted heavily, her sides heaving with exertion as she struggled to deliver the final member of her litter. "Something's wrong," Brian said, his experienced eye catching the subtle signs of distress. "This one's taking too long." After 30 minutes of increasingly labored pushing, the 5th kitten finally emerged. Even from their observation position, the staff could see that this one was different. It was noticeably smaller than its siblings, its body almost translucent in its fragility. Most concerning of all, it wasn't moving. "We need to intervene," Brian decided, his professional demeanor giving way to urgency. "That kitten needs help now." The delicate operation of separating a newborn from its mother was fraught with risk. In the wild, mother bobcats are fiercely protective of their young, and even a hand-raised cat like Maxine might react aggressively to perceived threats to her kittens. But there was no choice. The tiny life hanging in the balance demanded action. Ethan, who had the strongest rapport with Maxine, volunteered to enter the enclosure. Moving with deliberate slowness, he approached the den box, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "It's okay, Max. We're here to help. You're doing so well, girl." To everyone's amazement, Maxine didn't growl or attempt to shield her kittens. Instead, she watched Ethan with what almost seemed like recognition, her amber eyes blinking slowly, a sign of trust in feline body language. When he reached towards the motionless fifth kitten, she shifted slightly, as if making room for his hands. "I don't believe it," Jessica whispered. "She's letting him help." With infinite care, Ethan lifted the tiny kitten, cradling it against his chest as he backed out of the enclosure. Brian was waiting at the door, medical bag already open. "Get it to the clinic immediately," he instructed. "Oxygen, warming pad, the works. I'll be right behind you." As Ethan hurried towards the reserve's small veterinary clinic, Brian turned to Jessica. "Keep watching Maxine and the other kittens. If she seems distressed about the missing one, let me know right away. We may need to return it regardless of its condition." In the clinic, a flurry of activities surrounded the tiny kitten. Brian's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he cleared the little one's airways, administered gentle oxygen, and placed it on a warming pad. "Come on, little fighter," he murmured as he worked. "Your mama and siblings are waiting for you." For several heart-stopping moments, there was no response. Then, just as hope began to fade, the kitten gave a weak, almost imperceptible twitch. A moment later, its tiny pink mouth opened in a silent gasp, and its chest began to rise and fall in shallow breaths. "We've got signs of life," Brian announced, unable to keep the elation from his voice. "But we're not out of the woods yet." A closer examination revealed why the kitten had struggled so much during birth and why it was having difficulty now. Unlike its healthy siblings, this one had a structural abnormality, a slight deformity in its jaw and palate that would make nursing difficult, if not impossible. "It's a congenital defect," Brian explained to Ethan, who hovered anxiously nearby. "Not uncommon in wildlife, especially in areas with environmental contaminants. In the wild, this little one wouldn't stand a chance. But here?" Ethan asked, his eyes fixed on the tiny form that now squirmed feebly on the warming pad. Brian's expression was guarded. "Here, with intensive care, tube feeding until it's strong enough for corrective surgery, maybe. It's going to be a long road, though." "What about Maxine? Won't separating the kitten cause her distress?" "That's our other challenge. Ideally, we'd want this little one to bond with its mother and siblings, but it can't nurse effectively, and we can't risk it failing to thrive or preventing the others from getting what they need." The solution they devised was a compromise, a specially designed incubator placed just outside Maxine's enclosure, positioned so that mother and child could see and smell each other while the staff provided the fragile kitten with the specialized care it needed. Jessica, who had been monitoring Maxine's behavior, reported that the mother bobcat had seemed momentarily confused by the missing kitten, but had quickly returned her attention to the 4 healthy ones demanding her care. Still, she occasionally glanced towards the exit where Ethan had taken the 5th kitten, her ears pricked forward in what might have been concern. The days that followed established a new rhythm at Hillside Nature Reserve. The staff organized around-the-clock shifts to care for the fragile 5th kitten, whom they named Aspen after the quaking aspen trees that dotted the reserve, trees known for their resilience despite appearing delicate. Tube feeding a newborn bobcat required skill, patience, and a gentle touch. The specialized formula, designed to mimic Bobcat milk, had to be administered every 2 hours, day and night. Aspen's weight was meticulously documented. Each gram gained celebrated as a victory. The incubator, kept at precisely the right temperature and humidity, became the center of attention, with staff members stopping by throughout the day to check on the little fighter's progress. Margaret Wilkins, the reserve's 72-year-old founder, took a particular interest in Aspen's case. Though her arthritis made it difficult for her to participate in the hands-on care, she often sat beside the incubator, reading aloud from nature books in her soft, melodious voice. "My mother used to say that all creatures respond to stories," she told Brian one evening as they watched Aspen sleeping, the tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "I don't know if that's true, but it can't hurt to try." Meanwhile, Maxine proved to be an attentive mother to her 4 healthy kittens, nursing them, grooming them, and keeping them safely gathered in the den box. The wildlife cameras captured touching moments of maternal care. Maxine gently batting a wandering kitten back into the safety of the den, or patiently enduring the climbing antics of the more adventurous ones as they practiced their motor skills on her tolerant form. What surprised the staff most, however, was Maxine's continued interest in her absent 5th offspring. Several times a day, she would approach the mesh wall of her enclosure closest to where Aspen's incubator was placed, sniffing the air and making soft chirping sounds, the same vocalizations she used to call her other kittens. "She knows," Ethan insisted after witnessing this behavior. "Somehow, she knows Aspen is still alive and nearby." Brian was more cautious in his interpretation. "It could be that she smells our scents mingled with her kittens. Or it might simply be that her maternal instinct is telling her the count is off." Regardless of the explanation, the connection between mother and separated kitten became a source of both hope and concern for the staff. If Aspen survived, would reintroduction to the litter be possible? Would Maxine accept a kitten that smelled of humans and formula rather than her own milk? And perhaps most worryingly, would the healthy kittens, growing stronger every day, inadvertently harm their fragile sibling? These questions took on greater urgency as Aspen reached the 2-week mark, still alive but struggling. Despite the team's best efforts, the kitten wasn't gaining weight as quickly as hoped, and episodes of respiratory distress had necessitated emergency interventions twice. "We're reaching a critical decision point," Brian told the assembled staff during their weekly meeting. "Aspen needs surgery to correct the palate issue, but it's risky at this age and size. Alternatively, we continue as we are, knowing that tube feeding is stressful for the kitten and that each day separated from the litter makes eventual reintegration more challenging." The discussion that followed was passionate but respectful, with valid points raised on both sides. Some argued for immediate surgery, citing the stress of continued tube feeding. Others advocated for waiting until Aspen was stronger, even if that meant a longer separation from Maxine and the litter. In the end, it was Jessica who offered a third perspective. "What if we try partial reintroduction now?" she suggested. "Supervised visits with Maxine and the litter while continuing the supplemental feeding. If Maxine accepts Aspen, and if the kitten shows improved well-being from the contact, it might help us decide on the timing for surgery." The proposal carried significant risks, but it also acknowledged what many had observed, that both mother and separated kitten seemed to be experiencing distress from their continued separation. After careful consideration, the team decided to try Jessica's approach, with extensive precautions in place to ensure both Aspen's safety and the well-being of the other kittens. The first reintroduction attempt was scheduled for early morning, when Maxine was typically most calm after her night feeding. Brian, Ethan, and Jessica would be present, with Brian ready to intervene medically if necessary, Ethan prepared to manage Maxine if she became aggressive, and Jessica documenting the interaction. As dawn broke over the reserve, casting long shadows across the dewy grass, the trio gathered outside Maxine's enclosure. Aspen, now a bit stronger but still alarmingly small compared to what a 3-week-old bobcat kitten should be, was cradled in a soft towel in Brian's steady hands. "Remember," he cautioned, "we abort the attempt at the first sign of rejection or distress. Aspen's safety is paramount." With a deep breath, Ethan unlocked the enclosure door and stepped inside. Maxine, who had been watching their preparations with evident interest, rose from her resting place beside her sleeping kittens and approached, her movements deliberate but not threatening. "Hey, Max," Ethan greeted her softly. "We've brought someone to see you." Brian followed, moving slowly and keeping his body language open and non-threatening. When he was about 6 feet from Maxine, he carefully unwrapped the towel, exposing Aspen to its mother's view. The moment hung suspended in time, Maxine staring at the tiny kitten, her amber eyes unblinking, her posture frozen. The humans barely breathed, ready to retreat at the slightest sign of aggression. Then, with a sound that was half chirp, half purr, Maxine closed the distance between them. She sniffed delicately at Aspen, her whiskers twitching as she processed the scent of her offspring mingled with human hands and medical supplies. For one heart-stopping moment, she opened her mouth near the fragile kitten, and Brian tensed, prepared to pull Aspen away. But instead of aggression, what followed was a moment of such tender recognition that Jessica, filming the interaction, found tears streaming down her face. Maxine gently licked Aspen's tiny head, her rough tongue smoothing the fur that human hands had kept clean but that lacked the scent markers of maternal grooming. Aspen, seemingly energized by its mother's presence, let out a squeaky mew, the first vocalization the staff had heard from the struggling kitten. "It's like a miracle," Jessica whispered, her voice choked with emotion. After allowing Maxine to groom Aspen for several minutes, Brian carefully placed the kitten on the soft bedding near its siblings. The 4 healthy kittens, now with their eyes open and much more mobile than when they were born, immediately noticed the newcomer. They approached with typical kitten curiosity, sniffing and pawing at their smaller sibling. Maxine supervised this introduction with impressive attentiveness, gently nudging away kittens that became too boisterous and positioning her body to create a protective barrier around Aspen when the activity seemed overwhelming. "Look at that," Ethan marveled. "She's not just accepting Aspen, she's actively compensating for the size difference and fragility." The first visit lasted only 20 minutes, but its success transformed the mood at the reserve. Subsequent visits were extended gradually, always under careful supervision, with Aspen returned to the incubator for rest periods and supplemental feeding. To everyone's delight, the kitten began to show marked improvement, gaining weight more consistently, displaying increased alertness, and developing stronger responses to stimuli. By the 4-week mark, a new routine had been established. Aspen spent mornings and evenings with Maxine and the litter, receiving the socialization and comfort that only a mother and siblings could provide. Midday and overnight, the kitten returned to human care for supplemental feeding and monitoring. It wasn't ideal, but it was working. Aspen was not just surviving, but beginning to thrive. "I think we're reaching the point where we need to make a decision about surgery," Brian told Margaret as they observed Aspen playing, still awkwardly, but with increasing coordination, with a sibling during one of the supervised visits. "The palate issue isn't resolving on its own, as we'd hoped it might with growth, but Aspen is much stronger now. The risks are lower than they were." Margaret watched the Bobcat family thoughtfully, her weathered face creased with both concern and affection. "What does your instinct tell you, Brian?" The veterinarian considered the question carefully. "That we're at a window of opportunity. Aspen is strong enough now to withstand the procedure, but still young enough that healing should be rapid and complete. If we wait too much longer, we risk the defect becoming permanently established as the facial bones mature. And the separation from Maxine and the litter during recovery? That's my primary concern. We've seen how beneficial the family contact has been. Isolating Aspen again, even temporarily, could be a setback emotionally, even if the surgery is physically successful. Margaret nodded slowly. Sometimes, in nature and in medicine, there are no perfect solutions. Only best guesses made with compassion and knowledge. I trust your judgment, Brian. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in veterinary craniofacial surgery from the Virginia Veterinary Teaching Hospital, agreed to perform the procedure at Hillside, bringing her expertise and specialized equipment to minimize Aspen's travel stress. The day before surgery, the entire staff gathered for what they jokingly called Operation Aspen's Last Supper, the final pre-surgery feeding and visit with Maxine and the litter. The mood was both hopeful and anxious, with everyone acutely aware of the risks involved in anesthetizing and operating on such a small creature. No pressure, Ethan told Brian that evening as they finished the preparations for the next day. But I think every staff member, volunteer, and regular visitor is emotionally invested in this little cat now. My mother in Pittsburgh asks for updates every time we talk. Brian smiled wryly. No pressure at all. Just the hopes and dreams of an entire nature reserve riding on a surgery on a 2-pound bobcat kitten. Surgery day dawned bright and clear, with a chorus of birdsong greeting the early arrivals at the reserve. By 7 a.m., the small clinic had been transformed into an operating theater, with Dr. Rodriguez methodically arranging her instruments while her assistant prepared the anesthesia. We'll keep it short and focused, she assured Brian as they reviewed the preoperative scans one last time. 90 minutes maximum under anesthesia, with continuous monitoring throughout. The procedure itself was a testament to modern veterinary medicine's capabilities. Using techniques adapted from human pediatric surgery, Dr. Rodriguez meticulously repaired the structural defects in Aspen's palate and jaw, her hands steady and precise as she worked on an area smaller than a postage stamp. Brian, assisting with the anesthesia monitoring, found himself holding his breath at several critical moments, releasing it only when Dr. Rodriguez's calm voice announced, "That went precisely as planned. Excellent tissue approximation. I'm very optimistic about functional recovery." The post-surgical period brought new challenges. Aspen needed to be isolated not just from Maxine and the litter, but from anything that might damage the delicate surgical site. No toys, no rough surfaces, and certainly no enthusiastic siblings attempting to initiate play. Jessica, drawing on her background in educational psychology, suggested a novel approach to maintaining the mother-kitten bond during this forced separation. Using a technique similar to those employed with human preemies too fragile for direct contact, she set up a scent exchange system. Soft cloths were placed with Maxine and the healthy kittens for several hours, absorbing their scents, then carefully positioned near Aspen's recovery enclosure. Similarly, cloths that had been in contact with Aspen were introduced to Maxine's den, keeping the absent kitten's scent fresh in the family's awareness. Whether due to this innovative approach or simply Maxine's remarkable maternal instinct, the bobcat continued to show interest in her absent offspring, often spending time near the clinic building where Aspen was recovering, her behavior suggesting an awareness that transcended mere physical proximity. The 2 weeks of recovery felt agonizingly slow to the humans involved, but finally, the day arrived when Dr. Rodriguez, examining Aspen's surgical site, pronounced it healed enough for a cautious reintroduction to the family. "Remember," she cautioned, "no rough play, and we'll still need to supplement with bottle feeding for another few weeks. The repair looks good, but we want to give it every chance to strengthen before it's tested by normal kitten activities." The reintroduction was planned with the same care as the original separation, but with one significant difference. This time, the team was quietly confident of success. They had seen Maxine's extraordinary adaptability and patience, her ability to modulate her behavior, and that of her other kittens to accommodate Aspen's special needs. Their confidence was rewarded. When Aspen, still smaller than its siblings but now alert, vocal, and eager for interaction, was brought back to the enclosure. Maxine greeted the kitten with the same gentle attention she had shown before. The siblings, now 7 weeks old and considerably more coordinated in their play, approached their returned littermate with what almost seemed like recognition, their usual rough-and-tumble games noticeably gentler when Aspen was involved. "It's as if they understand," Margaret remarked, watching the reunited family through misty eyes. "As if they know this one needs special handling." While Brian's scientific training made him cautious about attributing human-like understanding to the Bobcat's behavior, even he had to admit that there was something remarkable about the social dynamics within Maxine's unusual family. Over the following weeks, Aspen's progress accelerated dramatically. The kitten began to nurse more effectively, though supplemental bottle feeding continued as a precaution. Play sessions with siblings grew longer and more vigorous, with Aspen displaying increasing coordination and strength. Most encouraging of all, vocalizations that had been weak and infrequent became robust and communicative, clear evidence that the surgical repair had restored not just structure but function. By the time the kittens reached the 3-month mark, an untrained observer would have had difficulty identifying Aspen from its siblings. Though still slightly smaller, the once fragile kitten now bounded across the enclosure with the same exuberant energy as the others, scaling the climbing structures, pouncing on enrichment toys, and occasionally testing Maxine's patience with typical kitten boundary pushing. "I think we can officially call this a success story," Brian told his colleagues during their regular case review meeting. "All developmental milestones are being met, and the latest scans show complete healing of the surgical site with excellent functional outcomes." The story of Maxine and Aspen might have remained a private triumph, known only to those directly involved, had it not been for a fortuitous connection. Jessica's cousin, a producer for a popular wildlife documentary series, visited the reserve during Aspen's recovery and was captivated by the unfolding drama. With Margaret's cautious approval, a small film crew was permitted to document the Bobcat family, with strict protocols in place to minimize disturbance. The resulting short film, titled Maxine's Miracle: A Mother's Love and Modern Medicine, aired as part of a series on wildlife rehabilitation successes across America. The public response was overwhelming. Viewers were moved by the combination of Maxine's remarkable maternal instinct, Aspen's fighting spirit, and the dedicated care provided by the reserve's staff. Donations poured in, allowing Hillside to expand its rehabilitation facilities and educational programs. More importantly, the story sparked conversations about the balance between conservation, intervention, and respect for wildlife's innate resilience. For the staff who had lived through the intense weeks of Aspen's struggle and recovery, the broader impact of their work was gratifying but secondary to the daily joy of watching the Bobcat family thrive. Each milestone, Aspen's first successful solo hunt of the enrichment prey items, the kitten's confident exploration of new areas of the enclosure, the gradual transition from mother's milk to solid food, was celebrated as a small but significant victory. "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing this one," Ethan remarked to Brian one evening as they completed their final checks before closing the reserve for the night. The Bobcat family was curled together in a contented pile, 5 spotted forms nestled against Maxine's tawny side, their synchronized breathing visible even in the dim twilight. Brian nodded thoughtfully. In the wild, Aspen wouldn't have survived. That's the reality of natural selection. But here, he paused, watching as one of the kittens, Aspen, he was almost certain, shifted position, stretching a paw across its mother's flank in a gesture of unconscious trust. "Here, we had the luxury of intervention," he continued. "Not to override nature, but to support it through a rough patch. The resilience, the healing, the adaptation, that was all Maxine and Aspen. We just created the conditions where it could happen." Ethan smiled, understanding the distinction his mentor was making. Balance, he said simply. Finding the right balance between doing too much and doing too little. Exactly. And sometimes, when we get that balance right, we're privileged to witness something extraordinary. As if in agreement, Maxine opened her amber eyes briefly, her gaze meeting the humans before she blinked slowly. That quintessential feline gesture of contentment and trust, and returned to her peaceful slumber, surrounded by the family that had defied the odds through a combination of natural resilience and compassionate intervention. In the soft evening light, with the forest whispering its ancient songs around them, it was impossible not to feel that they had been part of something profound, a small miracle of connection that transcended the boundaries between wild and tame, between human care and animal instinct. It was a reminder of what was possible when science, compassion, and respect for wildlife worked in harmony, creating space for healing and growth against seemingly impossible odds. And as Brian and Ethan quietly departed, leaving the Bobcat family to their well-earned rest, they carried with them not just professional satisfaction, but something deeper, a renewed sense of purpose and a profound gratitude for being allowed, however briefly, to participate in the remarkable journey of Maxine and her cubs.